This is the first time we've been able to be joined by someone other than John and myself. We got Dr. Clayton Cook here today with us. Really excited about this. This has been sort of a long time coming, and a relationship that I know that you and John go way back, Clay, and we've had a chance to work together a few times. But today is about strengthening the foundation of your school, how Character Strong fits into your school's multi-tiered system of supports, MTSS. Just a quick introduction, and I'll let you speak to yourself a little bit, Clay. But I know that you and John met many years ago through the lens of Sumner School District and some of the work that you're doing there. And haven't had a chance to work and talk with you a couple of times. I'm super grateful that you're here today because you speak about this work through a lens and a language that is so thoughtful and evidence-based and rooted in what I know is your passion for implementation science, and more than anything, making sure that this stuff works, works thoughtfully and effectively and from a scientific lens. So we're really grateful for you being here and excited for you to share today. Let's jump in.
All right. Yeah. John and I really had a long time working together in Sumner School District. And that was the first time I was able to see some of the elements of Character Strong in action. It was the first time I walked into a high school and you could feel it and you can actually see it in terms of the programming and the impact it was having. Most times I walk into a high school setting, students look at me as if I have some type of disease to be avoided. I'm not greeted. I'm not welcome. People aren't asking me questions if I need help with navigating the environment. And it was just a difference when I walked into the high schools in Sumner where students were owning those types of behaviors, greeting, shepherding around. And that's when I really was jazzed about the work that Character Strong presents. I have my accolades are on this slide, but most of what I think is relevant is I work with school systems across the country on thinking through how to design and implement multi-tiered systems of support to ensure that all kids are able to receive what they need to be successful, not only in school, but as a platform for life in general. And so we're going to go through today and talk about some of the basics of MTSS, how Character Strong really fits in and provides a solid foundation for work, and how it helps provide an essential ingredient to create what I consider the recipe for success at the Tier 1 level. And feel free, if people have questions, go ahead and ask those, because I'm happy with pausing and entertaining those questions.
My goal will be to put those in front of you whenever it makes sense. And just so people know, the questions that you add in the chat box there are private. We'll check through those, and then I can share them with you as we get towards the end, Clay.
Yeah, that sounds great. And at any time point, if there's a confusion, I hope people feel comfortable with voicing and expressing those. The way I look at a multi-tiered system of support, it's like an operating system on a computer. It helps organize just like an operating system does. It helps organize the hardware and make sense of it, and helps navigate and orchestrate kind of access and delivery. MTSS provides that. MTSS doesn't tell a school what to do. What it does is provide a framework to organize and orchestrate the delivery of a continuum of supports that hopefully match to the level of kid need. In that sense, MTSS organizes everything that a school does for all, some, and few students. It helps integrate and synthesize the programs, practices, and policies to make sure a school runs really, really well. And in that sense, MTSS doesn't articulate that you must implement certain practices and programs. Rather, it says you should select very high quality programs and practices to populate your continuum of supports in order to ensure students are able to access what they need. When there's a lot of talk around the importance of equity or needs-driven programming. And I think there's a philosophy of equity in education, and there's a philosophy of addressing student needs, but a lot of school systems are lacking the infrastructure to make that happen. So MTSS, to me, provides the infrastructure to enable equity to actually happen, and provides needs-driven programming. The way I define MTSS is really it's an equity-based, needs-driven framework that provides students with the services they need to be successful. And it views, from the stance of equity, as fairness isn't everybody getting the same thing. Fairness is really people accessing what they need to be successful. And that's ultimately what MTSS is trying to provide in school systems. From an implementation standpoint, MTSS really specifies and focuses on implementation because it is a service delivery framework. It's focusing on what the adults are adopting and delivering to provide students with access to high quality experiences and supports. And in that sense, it becomes a continuous improvement framework whereby systems can align their resources, their scarce resources, money, protected time, technical assistance, to those types of supports that they believe students need and ultimately need to receive in order to demonstrate benefit and success in schools. When you start to unpack MTSS and go beyond the terminology to what it really means, it is all about providing a continuum of supports. Some people do know, but many people in education don't understand the historical roots of MTSS. It actually originated in the 1940s with the public health model. And the public health model was organized around primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. The use of that model led to significant improvements in societal health that has increased the average age of our population, decreased all kinds of health-related issues. Education in the 1990s began to take the public health model and translate it into what we called the RTI model, response to intervention. And eventually it became into the 3-tier model and other names. And modern day terminology really refers to it as multi-tiered system of support. And at its heart, it's about providing a continuum of supports that are matched to student need. In a little bit, we're going to talk about how Tier 1 is that critical foundation that enables all other tiers to work well. And so if we're not doing really good work at the Tier 1 level, we create fractures in our system that ultimately weaken the potency of interventions for students who require additional supports to address their needs. And a lot of times I work with school systems, they ask me, what are the interventions for kids who are struggling, yet their Tier 1 isn't in place. For more intensive interventions to work, they have to be layered on top of and implemented in addition to a really solid foundation.
Like someone was asking just for a couple like real world examples, like what lives in a Tier 1, a Tier 2, a Tier 3, just so we can draw the line directly to people in practice.
Yeah, so I'm going to get to this in a little bit, but just for now to address it, why the question's here. So Tier 1 is, we think about what do all kids need? What are the experiences that they have to take in? And every kid is, you could argue, is entitled to those experiences. So things that are about cultivating relationships are a Tier 1 support, because all kids should have strong relationships with the adults who are in charge and have authority over them in the building, because it cultivates a sense of belonging and connection to that environment that optimizes well-being and performance. So we have different named practices. Those of you that are delivering Character Strong know that relationship practices are baked in to the approach. And so that's an example of a Tier 1 practice. Teaching a modeling expectation, so all students and staff are calibrated in their understanding, or what are the behaviors that result in success in school, is another example of a Tier 1. Tier 2 we often organize them according to performance or acquisitional needs. Some kids are going to struggle in school socially, emotionally, and behaviorally because they lack specific skills. Imagine kids who are struggling at school with anxiety problems, and they lack the ability to manage and cope with their anxiety, and it results in avoidance behaviors. So tier 2 would say, okay, we have a really healthy foundation and robust foundation of supports, yet we still have kids who need another layer of care to teach them specific coping skills to manage their anxieties so they're able to stay fully plugged into their social and academic experiences. When we go up the pyramid to tier 3, we're talking about intensive treatment and intervention. And this is largely for students who, need care delivered by a specially trained personnel, like a mental health provider. So I hope that provides some degree of differentiation among the tiers and some types of or examples what would be included in each of those levels.
That's awesome. Thanks, Clay. I know we'll have a visual to see that better here in just a minute.
So when we go, another idea is that we want high quality practices. And there's one way of research informs what schools should do, and we call that evidence-based, but we also have practice-based evidence, whereby a lot of times schools are in need of innovations that represent better ways of doing business, and research doesn't provide a lot of guidance. And in those scenarios, we got to gather what we call practice-based evidence. Schools that are doing things that they know are producing effect, but they're gathering from an evaluative standpoint, gathering data on whether those practices are working or not, so they can make informed decisions regarding whether they keep those practices or eventually move on and select something else to implement that will actually produce the intended benefits and changes. So we usually think within MTSS, where it's about maximizing the quality of the supports that are delivered at each of the tiers. So data-based decision-making is a piece of MTSS. So you could say one part of MTSS is delivering this continuum of supports. The other is to make timely, relevant decisions based on data. One example of that is what we call proactive detection. Universal screening is an example of proactive detection. You're going to screen all students within the population to determine whether they have a need for additional supports. And that's a data-driven, timely assessment that's done to drive early intervention. Early intervention doesn't occur without detection. So you can imagine in the area of cancer, if you wanted to provide early cancer treatment, you first would have to detect it early on when it's emerging in order to provide early intervention. The same thing is for students who are struggling academically, socially, emotionally, and behaviorally. We want to detect those problems right when they're emerging so we can be responsive and address students' needs. Progress monitoring is another data-driven process where when we implement supports, we're going to repeatedly gather data on how well students are responding to those supports so we can make timely, on-the-go decisions that best support students' needs. The last data piece is really about fidelity monitoring. When we select things to implement, we track and monitor fidelity so we can make sure students actually receive what they're supposed to be receiving. Students cannot benefit from things they never received. So fidelity becomes pretty critical to the make or break success of a variety of different programs, practices, or approaches. Character Strong falls within that. There's certain core components that if delivered well, you increase the likelihood of producing those types of desired effects. Teaming. There is no successful model on the planet without effective teams who engage in problem-solving processes that kind of own the implementation work in a building. So teams are about having distributed leadership. They understand what the core components are to implement a given program, practice, or approach well, and they are constantly trying to create experiences and put supports in place that increase the likelihood that adults deliver the support well so students can actually receive it and benefit it. So MTSS is dependent on teams of educators working together to ensure successful implementation. The byproduct of that is students are able to receive and access those high quality supports. So I'm going to transition into what are, I guess, more specific key concepts. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time here talking about Tier 1 due to its connection with Character Strong as a Tier 1 approach to really provide that solid base or foundation that enables kids to thrive within schools. I'll touch on other key concepts towards the end, but I'll spend the bulk of my time really focus on this first bullet here, and that is around the continuum of supports as a key concept, focusing mainly on the base, that Tier 1. So the big idea, I'm sorry, I'm like rapid firing with my button pushing. The big idea is multiple tiers. We've already gone over this. It's the idea of providing a continuum of supports or care that we can match to the level of kid need. The biggest problem we have in society in general is when kids have needs and they're unable to access what they need. When someone's unable to access what they need, they struggle and will exhibit problems. Those problems can impair their school and longer term life success. So in schools, we're constantly thinking about granting students access to what they need. And the best way to think about that is not all kids have the same level of need. So that requires schools to orchestrate the delivery of a continuum of supports that provide kind of a graduated sequence of supports that are different in their intensity. And that's ultimately what schools are trying to do when they're undertaking MTSS implementation. On the social, emotional, behavioral side, we could start to think about what are the continuum of support students may need there, as well as on the academic side. And that's why MTSS really is trying to integrate what we do academically, socially, emotionally, and behaviorally to provide a more holistic whole child approach. So I think the easiest way for people to understand this is the all some few model. We know Tier 1 is what all kids need. Tier 2 is what some kids need. Generally, Tier 2 supports are quick and easy to get up and running. They don't require a lot of specialty training in order to deliver, but they represent more intensive support above and beyond Tier 1. Tier 3 is for a few kids, and those supports are often intensive, and they require someone with specialty training to develop and implement. Like cognitive behavior therapy for kids who are struggling with emotional problems is an example of a highly effective gold standard mental health intervention that should be present in each and every school, either by staff on payroll or co-located mental health services by community-based mental health providers. But the person delivering that needs some degree of specialty training in order to deliver that intervention well. Functional behavioral assessment-based behavior intervention plans represents another Tier 3 intervention. The person who does that or guides that process in a school typically needs training in applied behavior analysis in order to do that well and collaborate and consult with colleagues to develop these multi-pronged behavior intervention plans that are effective. When we often have to have a triangle in any type of MTSS presentation, so there's your triangle. Let's go to the purpose of Tier 1 though, that base on that triangle. And I want to talk about 3 general kind of reasons. Most people think the reason why we do Tier 1 is to prevent problems, and that's partially correct. The reason why we want to make sure all kids access certain experiences and supports is to prevent problems from ever emerging, and that's the goal of primary prevention. If we could never see a problem emerge, great, that's really beneficial. But that's not the only reason why we do Tier 1. We also want to promote, enhance, or accelerate kind of success enabling factors. So you can think about like a strong relationship with a teacher. Not only may that prevent problems from emerging, but even if a student isn't exhibiting a problem, it can enhance and optimize their well-being and performance in a given class. So it's also a promoter in that sense. And a lot of kids may not be struggling, but they're not reaching their full potential. They're kind of flying below the radar, and there's a need to kind of enhance and optimize their well-being and performance. And so tier one not only prevents things, it also promotes. And I'll give you a metaphor that I like to use around the last bullet point here. So imagine tier one's a pond and is a dirty pond, and a kid's swimming in this dirty pond, and you have to take them out of the dirty pond. And the intervention is we're going to hose them off to clean the student up. But the student ultimately has to go back into the dirty pond. And unfortunately, a lot of the interventions we implement for kids with higher levels of need, they're implemented on top of weak foundations, and that undermines the potency and likelihood of success of our interventions. So we also think about tier one. If we recognize we have students with higher levels of need and we want those interventions to work and we want to increase our success rate with those efforts instead of wasting our time and energy, we really have to build a solid foundation, because those interventions are connected to what's happening foundationally for the student. You can imagine a kid who doesn't feel a strong sense of belonging in school and has weak relationships and is in a chaotic, unstructured learning environment. Those things will work against an intervention being effective, such as a mental health intervention. So it boils down to kind of three main purposes why we want to make significant investments to creating a solid, robust foundation of tier one supports. I want to talk more conceptually for a second, and just stick with me, because we can get to more of when the rubber hits the road and we're talking straight up implementation. If we look at the science of child development and well-being, we know that children develop really well and perform really well within certain types of environments. We call host environments the main environments in which kids spend the vast majority of their time. So school and home are critical host environments. And when those environments are nurturing, predictable, reinforcing, and responsive, kids develop really well, they perform really well, and when you check in with them, their well-being's at high levels. We also have the other side to this. We know there's a small subset of environmental factors that undermine children's development and performance. Those things like neglect, abuse, high amounts of criticism, lack of belonging, non-reinforcing environments, unresponsive environments, those types of things are not good for kids. So it's about schools really mobilizing and building kind of common language and practice to create these nurturing, predictable, reinforcing, and responsive environments, because unfortunately they don't just create themselves on their own. There's really intentional practice that needs to be leveraged in order to create these optimal environments. And so I want to just go through each one of these kind of terms, break them apart, and hopefully if you're steeped in the character strong work, you're going to be able to identify how specific practices, that helps create a nurturing environment. Well, that work is really about creating more predictability for students. Well, that's helping creating a reinforcing context, or that's being responsive. So when I talk about nurturing environments, we can easily measure this by how secure the relationships are among the people within a given setting. So horizontally speaking, what's the health of the relationships among this staff? Some of you may have experienced working in environments where the adults aren't getting along, and there is a trickle-down effect to impact students. Also, we have kind of vertical relationships, and that's between the adults and the students. We could measure the quality of the relationships, and it will predict school-level outcomes. This second bullet's a really important one, because in my mind, the true test of a nurturing environment is whether the adults who are in charge, when students make mistakes behaviorally, whether they are able to kind of set and enforce limits, but do so compassionately and with empathy. Because this is the antidote to creating a verbally, emotionally, and potentially in other contexts, physically abusive environments, whereby I've spent all this time to build healthy relationships, but when students make mistakes behaviorally, we react in ways, punitive ways potentially, that do more harm than good. So the true test of a nurturing environment is that we react and respond to student problem behavior with compassion and empathy, but we also are turning those into learning opportunities, because we're not just letting kids get away with stuff. We're helping teach that behaviors do have consequences, and there's things that they could do differently next time to better manage and handle certain situations. So those kind of are the two main characteristics of a nurturing environment.
If I could jump in there for a sec, Clay,
yeah, please.
I know this is where sort of, as we're talking through this tier one lens and talking about what kind of environment a tier one can create if done well, this is obviously where that like strong connection to character strong starts to come into play. And this slide obviously resonates with us through a couple of lenses. One of them is what John always talks about, is like high expectations with high supports. So it's like, you can be like, it's the tough and tender piece. That love and like the action of making sure students feel supported doesn't mean a lack of accountability. And I think that's so critical that we're able to do both really well. And one of the tools that I know we use, we call our serve model, right? That serve model that we've created to sort of tackle tier one from an educator toolkit lens. One of them is respond with empathy. That's the R in our serve model. And we use a tool that I know is sort of research validated through the prompt method, which is a progressive response system to problem behavior in a classroom. And it's really a tier one tool. So just to quickly tie those together, the prompt method is basically, if you're seeing low level problem behavior in a class, there's a number of steps that you take sequentially. And one of them, really the whole thing, is about responding with empathy, like you said here. But you want to speak to that just for a second? We don't have to go through the whole prompt method, but how maybe let's just tie together Character Strong's effort with the serve model and prompt to what we're talking about here.
Yeah, no, there's specific methodology, and this is the part where the rubber hits the road. Character Strong provides a way in which educators can adopt strategies that enable them to create these nurturing contexts. And when students engage in behaviors that do need a correction, they do so skillfully and in a way that helps the student learn from those experiences. And prompt is just that method that allows people to have kind of tools in their toolkit when it comes to reacting to student behavior and ensuring that students are able to, they are held accountable and they're able to learn from those experiences versus, having a sanction opportunity for punishment. And so prompt really ends with this idea of a teaching interaction, and it's a skillful communication that begins with an empathy statement, ultimately puts the student in a decisional dilemma to recognize the choices they can make, and the adult provides feedback based on the choice the student make. And it could mean for the student to get recognized and acknowledged for the positive decision they made. If they continue a problem behavior, then it's going to activate a more solution-oriented process to get at the root cause for why the kid's struggling in order to develop a solution that the student can use next time. So you you decrease the likelihood of that problem behavior happening again in the future.
Amazing. When we get to the end, it'd be fun to walk through an example, like a concrete example of how that plays out.
Yeah, definitely. There's a need for rehearsal with a lot of this, because it is, often we say we're off in a lot of the programs we're doing to create nurturing, predictable, reinforcing environments. We're changing how we behave within the same amount of time. We're not asking people to extend the school day. What we are saying is the opportunities to interact and engage in skillful practice are right in front of our face, and we often need to kind of go through the motions a few times in order to make it a habit.
Yeah, it's a skill set. That's awesome. Yeah. Thank you.
So the next one's predictable. So most of you probably know the marshmallow test. So, you put a little kid down and you put a marshmallow in front of them and you say, hey, don't eat that thing. And then you say, because if you don't eat that thing, I'm going to come back and give you 2 of them. Some of the kids eat the marshmallows right away. Some of them rub them on their face. Others are pretty stoic and they're like, nope, I'm getting my 2 marshmallows. But what a lot of people don't know around the marshmallow test, they've done other studies to show how environment impacts kids' ability to self-regulate. And this is where predictable environments enable kids to regulate better. So before doing the marshmallow test, they give a condition where they have a kid and they give them crayons, pretty lame crayons to color with, and say, hey, color with this. If you're able to color, I'm going to come back and give you this amazing art kit. And so they randomly assign kids to two conditions. One condition, the adult actually follows through and is consistent and gives the kid the art kit. The other one, the adult goes, well, I'm sorry, I forgot it, my bad. Then they give the kids the marshmallow test, and kids who previously would not eat the marshmallow test, when they're in the presence of an adult who's not consistent and doesn't create predictability, they go ahead and they don't self-regulate. They eat the marshmallow and they bail on it because they can't depend on the environment being predictable and following through. So a lot of the times what we're trying to do is, we know children thrive within environments where the adults who are in charge are working together to get on the same page and trying to maintain consistency with one another in terms of their language and practice. And that's all in the service of creating predictable environments. And so things like Character Strong really do have common language and practice, that what we're trying to do is build this kind of school-wide adult effort where the adults are investing in this and maintaining consistency in their actions. And when we create these type of consistent, predictable environments, kids can anticipate, students can anticipate what is expected of them. They're able to better regulate their behavior and stay plugged in. So predictable environments become pretty critical to students' well-being, and especially for kids who are struggling with pretty intense adversity outside of school, such as trauma. Kids who are actively experiencing trauma really need schools that are creating predictable, consistent environments. And unfortunately, if we're not careful, what we do is we build environments that are based on the moods of the adults, or whether the adults are well caffeinated yet, and that becomes pretty inconsistent environments that do more harm than good. And what we want to make sure is the adults are trying to bring it and joining forces with their colleagues to create this type of setting in which kids are likely to thrive.
So that's sort of what our serve model is trying to create, right? In many ways, a set of tools for fidelity that breeds consistency, right? Fidelity is sort of like the foundation of that consistency piece. So in our serve model, we talk about starting intentionally, engaging relationally, responding with empathy, values practiced consistently, and exiting intentionally. And for each one of those things, in response to what you're sharing here, Clay, we have what we're calling our serve staples, right? These things that are supposed to be done either a daily or a weekly or a monthly practice that in our conversations with you, the reason that we're sort of creating that pattern of consistency is exactly for this, the predictable environment. And unless you have tools or systems or reminders or even staff accountability, what we always say is this stuff falls to the bottom of the list. Mm-hmm. When we get busy, this is the first stuff that goes. So how do we create a simple, low burden set of practices that are sort of those keystone habits that, if done with fidelity, create exactly what you're saying here, that predictable environment? So we have lots of tools through our serve model, but we have our serve staples that speak to this right here.
Yeah, that's exactly how the work gets done in order to create this. The outcome of that work is you create predictable environments and you start to notice kids developing and growing and performing better within that context. So the reinforcing environment is, we know in environments that are low on reinforcement, people feel like they're not acknowledged, their value and worth isn't recognized, and they feel like they're taken for granted. So there's two forms of creating a reinforcing environment. One is what we call non-contingently acknowledged. Students and staff are non-contingently acknowledged, just to recognize they're there, express some type of value, and they have worth as a person. So things like greetings, check-ins, and farewells are all non-contingent kind of ways of acknowledging people. Even if you had a rough day with a student the previous day, are you capable of positively greeting? That would be a non-contingent. It's not contingent on that the kid had a great day the previous day. And that's what we mean by non-contingent. You could say unconditional, if you will, as a replacement term there. And then there's contingent recognition, where the people in charge are there to contingently recognize behavior, effort, or contributions to the greater good through effective praise, accessing privileged social activities or experiences. And that's contingent upon specific behaviors people have engaged in, the effort they've put in for something, or they've made a contribution that's gone above and beyond to the greater good of the school community. We do this, for staff and students. For staff, we can do things like surprise car washes. Staff come out and their car's washed, and why? It's a token of appreciation and acknowledgement for the energy and effort. A staff comes in the morning, their favorite caffeine's waiting for them. We use Bite Squad or Grubhub, and we order people their favorite food item during lunch. We have ways of celebrating staff, and that's just an example of contingent recognition systems that are also good for staff, because if staff are well, they're better capable of producing well students. Unwell staff have a hard time producing well students. And so we're often nurturing and supporting and reinforcing the adults along with the students in order to kind of create this optimal environment where all human parts of this school system are doing as well as they could. Hope I'm speaking English there. I felt like I was going off the deep end a little bit. But you get the point. We need to create reinforcing environments where people are non-contingently and contingently acknowledged. So they are seen, they're recognized, and it's a way of showing appreciation for who they are and the energy and effort they're putting in as a member of the school community. Responsive environment. Now, the opposite of a responsive environment is a neglectful environment. And so what we're trying to do here is to prevent neglect. And we can create neglectful school environments, not on purpose. Nobody's getting up in the morning saying, I'm going to neglect a few people today. And it's going to be incredible. I can't wait. But if we're not aware and intentional, what we end up doing is potentially neglecting things that are going on with certain students. And we're plugging away as if the academic, like that math thing, is the most important thing in the kid's life, when in fact, the kid hasn't been able to get good sleep for 3 straight days because of home issues. And so we have to modify. So a responsive environment understands the needs kids bring to the educational table and tries to adapt and modify how they interact or their requests depending on the needs of the individual. If something socially is going on with the kid and it's causing the kid to be distracted or disengaged, that needs recognized, and staff kind of mobilize, support, and interact with them in ways to try to address and fix that problem for them. Another example from an MTSS framework is a responsive environment is an environment that provides early, timely intervention. One of the biggest issues in many schools is called the wait to fail model. Kids who are struggling go long periods of time without ever receiving a proper support. So within an MTSS framework, schools get really good at proactively detecting the students who have needs in order to provide early, timely intervention. And that's another kind of element or dimension of a responsive environment. So collectively, one way to think about MTSS is we're putting energy and effort across staff to develop common language and practice that enables us to create nurturing, predictable, reinforcing, and responsive environments. So if anybody's heard me talk before, I like to just break it down things into metaphors. And I think a baking metaphor really is helpful because lots of schools are doing good things, but what they have is good ingredients. They don't have kind of the full recipe. They want these types of outcomes over here, but they're implementing these ingredients, but expecting these outcomes. And there's no evidence on the planet that you can actually achieve all that with that single ingredient alone. So instead we think about what's the recipe? What ingredients do we need to combine together to produce the outcomes we want? And in that way, we're integrating pieces to create this kind of whole. And when we have these factors or in these ingredients in place, we're likely to see the beneficial outcomes. An ingredient, you can think about it as a component of a recipe that is necessary but insufficient. So to me, an ingredient like building relationships with students will never become a bad idea. It's not a fad, it's not a trend. we have enough science, and we have enough logic and personal anecdotes, all of which agree with one another, that relationships are a necessary ingredient to ensure kids kind of profit from their learning experiences and are doing well in school. Now, we can also say that relationships alone aren't going to help kids learn, because you can imagine someone who's really, really good at relationships but weak at instruction. Alternatively, you can imagine someone who's really, really good at instruction but weak at relationships. And what we're going for here, it's an and both. It's not an either or. So the ingredients are, we need kind of both of those things, and we got to combine them together into this recipe. So you can think about character strong as being an ingredient, a potent ingredient that has pieces with it that, when combined with academics and other work, really create this recipe that enables a school to, provide that foundation of supports that enables kids to really learn and do well. Here are the evidence-informed ingredients, and we just label these. So if we went through each one of these and thought through them, the first one is an environment ingredient, where the adults are working together to create a safe, structured, predictable, and positive environment. So they are doing things in order to make this happen. Once you have an ingredient, you have to select something to implement. The next one ingredient is relationships. There's dedicated common language and practice whereby people are trying to make sure everybody feels a sense of belonging and trust and respect in the building. And if there's students who don't feel that way, we can't let anybody fall through the relational cracks. Our work in schools indicates that over 95% of educators believe in the power of relationship and say they're an essential ingredient, but very few schools have dedicated common language and practice that are all about making sure all students feel a sense of belonging, trust, and respect in the building. The next ingredient is this teaching and modeling. And really, the teaching and modeling is blowing up our notion of what teaching and learning is in a district, and saying teaching and learning encompasses the full range of knowledge and skills, social, emotional, and academic knowledge and skills necessary to support students to be able to meet the demands of work, civic, and home life in adulthood. The purpose of the school is to ensure that students have this knowledge and the skill sets that go along with that knowledge in order to go navigate life in adulthood. And we can think about the critical knowledge and skills that enable people to be successful in work, civic aspects of living, and private in their private lives. Agency is another ingredient that we find is really critical for schools to develop common language and practice around. And we think about this as motivation, sense of purpose, or future orientation. And there are evidence-based practices that can be delivered to increase students' internal motivation, as well as their orientation to the future, so they have a sense of purpose about who they want to become later on, and they begin to see school as part of a process to get them to where they want to go in life, and where they want to go represents things that are meaningful and valued. The next piece is this idea of relentless family support and engagement, that we know it takes a village, and schools that engage in common language and practice to ensure that they're supporting and engaging families to the best of their capability are often associated with superior outcomes than schools that are doing limited in this area. So for tier one, I just want to go back before we don't have a ton more time, but I would just want to go back and just make sure we have this. Tier one is really about taking ingredients that are necessary to create a recipe. Once you have an ingredient, you have to select something to implement. When we select something to implement, what comes with that is common language and practice that allows staff to communicate with one another about it and consistently deliver supports and experiences that are designed to bring that ingredient to life, if you will. So we need things around environment, relationships, teaching and modeling, things that promote student agency and ensure that we adopt a stance of relentless family support and engagement. So proactive detection, I'm going to rip through these final kind of ideas. And The proactive detection, when we think about it, is how do kids go from tier 1 to tier 2? And the main way is you can use existing data, behavioral discipline, unexcused absences, other sources of existing data, and you establish decision rules. How many times does a kid need to be referred to the office before it activates a process to consider whether the kid needs an intervention? Many schools, kids can have 15 office referrals before they receive a support. And that's a very reactive, that's consistent with the wait to fail approach. Instead, proactive schools will establish decision rules. And anytime a kid crosses that threshold of like 3 unexcused absences, it activates a process to determine whether the kid has a need for an intervention. You can use universal screeners. Universal means all kids are looked at to determine whether they have a need. And so screeners really are getting at whether the kid has needs in particular areas. And if they are flagged as having a kid's need, that doesn't mean they need special ed. What it means, we need to activate a tier 2 support process and get an intervention in place. The last is we can use structured teacher nomination. And that's providing teachers with more objective ways to nominate and refer students who they have concerns about and they think may have a need for additional support. These are examples of existing screeners. I'm not going to go over them, but I thought it might be helpful to just get your eyeballs on a few of those. Progress monitoring, it's also a formative assessment. When we get to...
I'll just jump in real quick because people have asked. And you said people would be helpful to get people's eyes on it. Just so folks know, we will be sending out a recording of this, so you can go back and take a look at those. And please, if you have any questions about some of those tools, those progress monitoring tools, or those, I'll go back just one real quick, the screening tools, drop us a note in the chat here or send us an email and we can get these to you.
And Houston, what I could do is send you and John, we have a separate PowerPoint that reviews all them and just puts the cost, the time, how much research is on different screening tools. So then schools can make kind of informed decisions about which ones may be best suited to them. And I can share, and you guys can feel free to actually send that out as a resource to people.
Awesome. Thanks, Clay.
The progress monitoring is, we have all kinds of examples like blood pressure cuffs, thermometers, and the whole goal is to get metrics that determine whether a intervention or support is working or not. And that information is then used to make changes. If you find that it's not working, then you can make a change to do something else. And so progress monitoring is a form of formative assessment. Once we start an intervention, we're going to repeatedly monitor the kid's response to that so we can make data-driven decisions on the go, not after the fact. We don't wait 12 weeks and then ask ourselves if it's working. Usually we peek at whether the intervention's working around 4 weeks into it to determine whether it's working or not. If it's not working, we can make changes right then instead of later when we find out that it hasn't been working for a long time. So that's the essence of progress monitoring, very brief assessments. In the area of behavior, we have progress monitoring tools that take people only about 5 seconds to complete, and they're reliable and valid. And so you can repeatedly gather those data over time. Typically, you put the data into a graph and you make what we call decisions based on visual analysis of the graph data. So you can imagine a baseline where the kid's low, you put in the intervention and the kid gets better. You can see that very rapidly versus the typical types of decisions people make. We get together in groups, we have no data, and we say, how's it working? And people start to make up stuff. Well, it's going all right. It's going pretty good. And we know people's decision-making is pretty fallible when it comes to subjective impressions. Things like reputation effects, cultural biases can actually plague people's ability to make accurate decisions. Treatment integrity. We got to get things implemented. Implemented is really the process of putting practices into effect so students can receive those things. Evidence-based practices are just things with evidence that support their use. When we think about why fidelity is important, we have to do some work to help people understand that all professions, fidelity provides that common language and practice. So a pilot from American could talk to a pilot from Southwest. There's common practices that enable them to safely fly. and they can engage in dialogue. There's certain things that they do. We know physicians have certain practices that enable certain procedures to go well. Mechanics, you could talk about engineers, farmers. There's common languages and practices that are all about an outcomes-driven process, and education's no different. So implementation is an outcomes-driven process. And when we talk implementation, we have to understand fidelity, and fidelity are those core things that we need to be doing to ensure that kids actually receive what they should have received, because though that's what is responsible for producing those outcomes. And so education's really no different than other fields when it comes to the importance of fidelity. Obviously, our fidelity is different because we do different things. We teach, we interact, we motivate, and those are often the types of practices we try to maintain fidelity to. Data-based decision-making is a key concept in MTSS, and largely we use three pieces of data: screening data, or that proactive detection data, progress monitoring data, and fidelity data. But it's really a commitment to using data to inform decision making rather than someone who has the most forceful personality, subjective impressions, hunches, best guesses. And unfortunately, those types of decisions that are more subjective in nature haven't done a lot of good for students, particularly students who are often the most disadvantaged ones and the ones in our school systems. We have long-standing kind of achievement and opportunity gaps that persist year after year with no changes. Data-driven decision making has been shown to reduce those types of opportunity and achievement gaps. So I'm going to, just for sake of time, this is how we combine data. On a column over here, we have the positive response or no response, that's a student, and we have sufficient or insufficient fidelity. And typically when we're making a data-driven decision, we're trying to locate what is the best decision we should make based on the data that's at our fingertips. And so it determines the next action step we take when we have data to inform our decisions. Because if kids are doing well and we're sufficiently implementing, we're going to maintain that. If kids aren't responding well and we're not implementing, the decision is to find what we're not implementing well and improve fidelity. That's the next action step. Too often schools rapidly adopt and abandon programs or practices without sufficiently implementing them. And you can't blame a program or practice as not working if you're not delivering it with fidelity. The last piece I'm going to just leave you with, and then I'll shut up, is that ongoing problem-solving processes. We're constantly trying to be embedded in a solution-oriented discussions, and unfortunately, many educators get stuck admiring the problem, where they talk about factors that are beyond their control and never get around to making a change or identifying a solution to implement. So it's really a commitment to problem solving through a structured process. And you could do this at a school-wide level, you could do it at a tier 2 level or a tier 3 level. And it's really being able to identify the main concern, determining why that concern is happening, to generate a solution, developing a plan to address that solution, and evaluating whether it works or not. And so MTSS is also referred to as a problem-solving model because it's committed to kind of solution-oriented discussions and efforts. And that's what I got.
Amazing, Clay. Thank you so much for, I know that was a lot in a short period of time. So thanks for, first of all, giving the sort of that overview of MTSS and how it relates to the work. And then I know that we've been so grateful to have your vision, your expertise, your voice speaking to how Character Strong connects those dots really effectively, knowing that tier 1, knowing that when you have cracks in that tier 1, you're creating opportunities for more energy and effort in those tier 2 and tier 3s. And you're creating actually, as you say, less effective sometimes interventions at tier 2 and tier 3s because you're putting kids back into the dirty pond. So we have to focus on that tier 1. The question is always, like, if we know what the problem is, instead of admiring it, how do we get to that solution? And that's the work that I know we've partnered quite a bit on to make sure that Character Strong is that really strong tier 1 approach. I know one of my favorite things you talk about is that ultimately we're in the business of adult behavior change. And that's what a lot of tier one energy has to go towards. It's that proactive adult behavior change systematically and thoughtfully that when done consistently and predictably over time, that's what creates the clean pond. And those are, like you say, they're learned behaviors, right? They're skill sets that we have to proactively teach. And, one of the things that sometimes we look at students and seeing and notice a competency gap in them. And I think it's just as important to understand that many of us in the business of education have competency gaps of how do we respond with empathy to students that are frustrating to us. And one of my favorite examples that I know John has shared with me that you recommend is you wish you had every teacher had a stop sign in the back of their classroom as a reminder when they're getting frustrated or overwhelmed or angry with the student, instead of reacting out of frustration, instead to walk through that prompt method. So a couple of quick questions, and I know we're short on time, but if folks are willing to stick around for a moment, I was interested just in like how that rubber meets the road. Could we give an example of a prompt method in action? Student in the class.
Yeah. The way it would work is, so imagine you have a couple of students in the class and they're disrupting others' ability to learn. And, the first thing I always do is could well-regulated adults do this during an all-day learning experience? Have you ever seen adults talk about off-topic things when they shouldn't be? And so the first thing I do is that's actually normal human behavior, but I do want to decrease the degree to which it's distracting. So the first thing I'm going to do is try to just use proximity. So I'm going to go over and stand by it. And a lot of times 50 to 60% of problems correct themselves simply by proximity. And I don't even have to make a big deal. I don't have to publicly do anything that could activate the kid's fight or flight response or do any of that. The next thing, if that's not working, I have redirection strategies. I'm still not making a big deal out of it, and I'm going to redirect the students to do something that there's a high probability that they'll say yes to, so I can gain some kind of momentum and compliance with that, and they're more likely to come back, and I can kind of break the episode of the behavior. I can progress down my interactions all the way to a teaching interaction. Maybe I gave the redirection and the kid tells me to go shove it. I don't feel like doing anything. So now I'm going down to a place where I'm going to have to interact with the kid through a skillful conversation. So I'm going to have a private conversation, and the first thing I'm going to lead into that is an empathy statement. And I'm going to say, what's up? What's not working for you? What you might get from a student is, I don't know. And it's very typical. So then I'm going to make a guess. And sometimes when we make an empathy statement, if the student tells us what's going on, then we can actually understand where they're at. But if they don't tell us, then we have to guess, and then they'll let us know if we got it right. So I'm going to say something's not working for you because you don't feel like doing the work, which I get it, because I've been in plenty of settings where I'm not feeling up to doing the work, and I've done other things. So I get it. Something's going on. So it's either boring or you don't think it's relevant. Something's going on, and I want to fix that for you. And so what is going on? Is that true? And the kid says that. So great. Here's the deal. And you'd follow it up. Right now you're talking and other students around you aren't able to get their work done. What I need you to be able to do is, do the work that's in front of you. If it's writing or it's reading something or it's interacting in a small group, get back kind of on task. You got a couple of choices to make here. You can go ahead and go do that and get back on track, of which I'm going to come back to you and figure out what's not working for you, because I don't want you to feel that way in my class. You could keep up disrupting, and there's going to be a natural and logical consequence associated with that decision. I'm going to give you a little bit of think time. So you give someone a little bit of think time to chew on it. You come back and you ask them what their choice is. And this is the accountability. If they make the choice to get back, you say, great. So what's bothering you about it that you don't like? Because I want to understand that, because I'm not cool with you feeling that way, where the last thing you want to do is do the work and you would rather just, engage. It's communicating something that's not working for you. So I appreciate you getting back on work so I can actually, have this conversation with you. If the student does it, then typically there is an in-class kind of natural and logical consequence. that could go. It may mean not being able to access a privilege that they could have otherwise earned, that there's free time, or there's ability to, use technology in class, or choose where they sit, or who they work with, or whether they take work home or not. And so that could be a natural and logical consequence that's attached to the behavior without having to remove the kid from the environment. Because what we want to prevent is the types of removals from environments that cause students to feel like they're not wanted, that harm relationship, and ultimately stigmatize kids. Because a lot of kids who get removed for their behavior get known as the bad kids, and now we're have to compensate for the stigma around that student as being a troublemaker, or whatever type of pejorative label comes along with that.
I think sometimes we accidentally create fixed mindsets in kids when we non-verbally label them in that way, with repeatedly making that choice for them.
Yeah.
I love that. Thank you, Clay. And someone here commented even, how do we, this is a big prompt for us, how do we get the adults in our building to be aware and trained to deliver with fidelity? And I suppose that's the ongoing question. And one of the ways that I love that we get to work together is you get to give us some of these research-backed strategies, and then that's our work. Our work is going into buildings and doing some of that training, right? Because the only way, as John says, we need to be reminded more than we need to be taught. So this is not only a skill set to be delivered, but then you also need, in the same way that you need it with students, you need that predictability and consistency with adults. We need to come back to this often with the teachers in our building and remind them, hey, are we doing this thing? Are we on track? Are people using the prompt method? How are we starting intentionally? And all those sort of staples, I think that's a critical piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, it's the beliefs of the adults that we got to start with, and we're shifting their beliefs and mindsets around this work first, and that creates the buy-in for the behavior, like utilizing the prompt. We know, for example, 50% of staff in a given building believe that punishment works, and that represents really important beliefs that we got to address. And we do so non-confrontationally through reflective exercises to help people recognize that punishment is ineffective, and it has negative side effects with it in terms of how kids feel in school, the relationship with the adults, and some of the stigmatizing effects, and that there are alternative solutions that represent more skillful and effective ways to react to problem behavior. But typically we do have a lot of those belief barriers that prevent the adoption and delivery of some of these practices. And that's why we always have to start with the adults first if we want to improve student outcomes. Kids get better when the adults change to create more nurturing, predictable, reinforcing, and responsive environments. And the adults are largely in charge of kind of, initiating and creating those types of settings.
So good. It's so true. That's the hard work.
It is the hard work. Are you on mute?
I was so excited though.
No, that was really good acting too.
Yeah. I was just sharing that it's hard work because it's paradigm shifting, right? Our old paradigm, let's say as educators, when we were in school, punishment was a thing. It's almost like the kids that sit in the senior section at school. It's like, we want a more inclusive school with no cliques. Cool, let's go to the senior section. Well, I'm a senior now. I should sit in the senior section.
Yeah.
And it's like, it is that, how do we shift normal? We have to break old paradigms and break belief patterns in order to create something new. And a lot of that is, number one, the building readiness work of implementation, which is that belief work. And then it's the tool piece, right? The competency piece of, okay, now that we've broken this belief, here is the tool and how to do it. And now it's a skill set that we have to earn in order to do it well. Exactly. One more quick question, if you have time for it, Clay.
Yep.
It seems related a little bit to that behavior piece at the end. This is for my friend Diana Davis, Milton Hershey School. How can you effectively reinforce positive behaviors without creating a carrot and stick environment that encourages extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation?
Yeah, the way I look at those two is it's all about contingent access and contingent restriction. So we're building kids from the outside in and the inside out. When kids' internal motivation's low, we depend on external sources to help regulate. And the adults are the walking, talking for some kids who are dealing with a lot of outside stuff that are sapping their internal motivation. They depend on things external to them to help regulate their motivation to stay engaged. But that doesn't mean while we're doing those things, we're not modeling the language and helping them internalize some of the things that will enable them to develop the internal governors over their behavior. So when we think about the blend of things we're doing, yes, we're obviously external to students ourselves. So our recognition, our feedback, the way we show appreciation for students' behavior and energy is extrinsic or external to them. But if I just sat there and said, good job, but didn't elaborate why it was a good job and why the students should have a sense of pride in what they've been able to do, we're missing the opportunity to kind of model the language to enable kids to acquire kind of the internal dialogue and ultimately governor over their kind of the agency stuff, where the student, that script becomes their own, and that's the narrative they've developed, and that's where we see kids who are more internally motivated. So we're constantly in this struggle of like trying to optimize kids' motivation to plug in and get the most out of their experiences. And there's all kinds of factors physically going on in their environments that, diminish internal motivation. And so we often have to have these external regulators in place to help govern that.
Yeah, I think it's also paired with the explicit teaching of the proactive skills, right? Instead of the reactionary, which is not what we're supposed to not do. It's also teaching emotional regulation and teaching discipline and teaching resilience through a proactive approach to character development. I think that's when we create a sense of purpose, when we help young people wrestle with purpose, and purpose needs to be bigger than just I go to school to get good grades or get into a good college, right? We help students wrestle with purpose when we provide them with those practical relationship building techniques. And if the adults in the building are role modeling that relationship almost always, like that's why we'll work hard in school, is for the relationship, not for the grade. And we could be motivated by the grade, but it is ultimately the deeper intrinsic motivation comes from those authentic, predictable environments that we create. And we do that proactively. Character Strong, we do it, I think, primarily not only through adult behavior, but through an advisory curriculum that with consistency and repetition puts young people into the practice of, the exercise of character, of like, what does it mean to actually put kindness into action? Not just be disciplined for not being kind, because our core belief is kids want to be kind. They don't always know what kindness looks like. So we have to give them consistent dosage of what this looks like in practice, so that they can actually cultivate that skill, both mainly intrinsically if we do our job well. There's another question here that I want to briefly talk about, and then we'll wrap up. And because I think it's a worthwhile paradigm shift around discipline and why Tier 1 is ultimately so important. But someone at the end of your prompt dialogue was talking about is having a consequence not considered punishment?
No, so we say things like, what is the difference between effective discipline and punishment? Punishment is driven by the desire to inflict pain, psychological, emotional pain. It's driven by retribution. The person should pay for the wrong in their ways. Now, effective discipline may mean there's a consequence where someone loses out on something that they could have otherwise earned. Like a parent in a home, if there's something where the kid doesn't earn the right to use their car, it's just, you didn't earn the right because you did something dangerous for a little bit, and you can earn it back by demonstrating the choices and stuff that enable me to trust that you're going to make responsible decisions. But it's naturally and logically, if I made that decision, it would be related to something where I'm worrying about your safety and things like that. But now I've restricted access to that. But I'm staying in relationship. I'm having empathy that this is hard. And it's kind of like how you deliver it and whether what you're doing as a consequence in terms of restricting access to that could have otherwise been earned is done so with empathy and compassion. And that's the setting and enforcing limit. You destroyed part of this environment, and you're unable to go hang out with your friends until you make good, and you're going to have to clean up things and restore it back to its previous order. That's you're restricting access to something, and you have to make a contribution to make good on this situation. And I'm not making the person feel like they're an inferior or horrible human because they made a mistake. So we often say it's called separating the deed from the doer. You have worth and value and dignity as a person, but we recognize that behavior we can clean up and we can work on that. And the reason why you're unable to do that is because of X. And let's develop a game plan so we don't have to repeat this again in the future. And so that's the differences versus get rid of them, send them home, do something to them so they can actually feel some degree of pain, and I can have retribution because they did something that I didn't like. And that's where that approach does more harm than good, than effective discipline. So I hope I was clear on that.
That's awesome. Yeah, natural versus punitive, right? Explaining the natural consequence versus just now you're being punished.
Because I want to make you pay.
Okay, thank you so much. I know we've gone over on time, and there's still, people. There's like this is not an hour-long conversation, but we tried to put it into a space at least to get the conversation going. And I know that we'll have some more conversations, both in person, and we'll do more webinars together because you're such a wealth of information, and it is both theoretical and practical. And I'm grateful for all the wisdom you've provided today, but also all of the huge help you provided in helping make sure that Character Strong really does work on that tier 1 piece, knowing that if we do that work well, everything else gets better, everything else gets easier. It doesn't make the work of tier 1 any simpler, but when we do that work thoughtfully and effectively, we're serving kids and we're serving adults, which is pretty cool. So really, really grateful for your time and energy. Our next webinar, without Clayton Cook, unfortunately, but it'll be February 25th from 12:30 to 1:30 Pacific Standard Time. And that one is about engaging everyone through a different view of school spirit. I'm excited about that. Change some more paradigms around behavior and that definition of school spirit and how we do that work well. If you have any questions, you can always email us at contact@characterstrong.com. Or you can set up a call with myself or John, calendly.com/characterstrong. We'd love to chat more about how the work we're doing through Character Strong, professional development, our educator trainings, and our curricula help serve that tier 1 foundational work that will make your culture and climate that much better. So thank you, Dr. Clayton Cook, for your time. And thank you all for showing up and sticking around. It's been great. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, my pleasure. Take it easy. Bye.